In this PowerPoint, we will look at how we use the command terms in GCSE Geography. So start off with the simple one, identify, state or name. You're pretty much just recalling a piece of information. There's a chance you'll be using a resource and identifying something off the resource. In this, we're looking for a single word answer, or in some cases, as is the case in question B here, just a tick box. So you put a little cross in southwest of England. Farming is one example of an activity that affects the landscape. State one other. You just have to say the name of it. So you could write deforestation or urbanization there. And there's the mark scheme. You will be credited for any of those terms where there's a slash. So building of roads / rail, it's one or the other. Easy marks to get, so make sure you spend enough time on them just to get it right. Here with define, you have to say what something means. Important here, of course, not to use the word you've been asked to define in the actual definition or any conjugation thereof. Just have a look at an example question. Define the term urbanization, increasing proportion of people living in towns and cities. And there we go. Accept any other reasonable response. Once again, make sure you spend enough time on it to get this mark because it's quite easy. Define the term GDP. You're going to say what gross domestic product means. So you need to come out with a sentence that explains that it is the total wealth or income earned by a country in a year. Here we have draw plot. In this, you have to complete a graph. Ordinarily, you may have to add a line of best fit, something along those lines. And so here, you have to draw on a couple of points on probably a bar chart or maybe a scatter graph. And then part 2 is to draw a line of best fit. Obviously, part 2 being slightly harder because you have to have more understanding of it. And you'll get marked for the accuracy of the plots for part 1 and for part 2 for having a reasonable best fit line. Important here that you make sure that those plots on that graph are accurate. Just like the identify marks, quite easy ones to get compared to those that you'll be trying to get later on in the paper, so worth a few more seconds just to make sure you get it in exactly the right place. Particularly pay attention to the scale. Make sure you've worked out how much one little box is worth. Is it worth 2 or 10 or whatever? So this command term is label. You have to label a feature that will appear on maybe a photograph or possibly a diagram. Here I've been given a photograph of a tombolo with a beach with dunes, so I want to just clearly label one of these features. I'll go for the beach here, so I've drawn an arrow connecting to the beach. I'll take that out to the side. Right, beach there. I could have labelled tombolo, or maybe I could have said that these are dunes here, and I could have labelled that dune. Here's the mark scheme below. Accept any other reasonable response. Really only problems with doing this, of course, you have to know what the features look like. Make sure you're labeling the correct one. It has told you they want a depositional feature, so don't label cliffs or anything of that nature. And as I said, because there's no line under it, pupils commonly miss this one out, so you need to make sure that you've accounted for all of your marks. Moving into the slightly more sophisticated command terms, here we have describe. Here you're likely to be looking at some kind of image like a map, a choropleth map maybe, or a graph, and you're going to be trying to give a view of what is happening in that image. It could also be something to do with the process, so this follows this follows this. In this you're looking to extend a point, but there's no sense that you have to justify or explain points. That's not what we're looking at in this situation. So here we have describe one disadvantage of using the method in figure 1b. Here we have figure 1b, where we can see that the number of people employed in one area is down here, and unemployed in one area is down here, and so we can see that this striped pattern is the area with the greatest levels of unemployment. Well, they've actually labelled Gipton and Hare Hills, so I'm going to discuss those. Now, what could be a problem with this? Ask me for a disadvantage. Well, one clear disadvantage is it assumes that all of Gipton and Hare Hills has the same amount of unemployment, that unemployment is uniform along Gipton and Hare Hills. It also suggests that if I were walking north through Gipton and Hare Hills, just as I crossed this point here, people would go from being very likely to be unemployed to very likely to be employed, just by stepping over that line. Both of those things are unrealistic, so I may look towards coming up with an argument based upon that. Here's my mark scheme. You get 1 mark for disadvantage and 1 for further extension. And so you should be aiming at 1 point and extending it rather than 2 separate observations. So incorrectly suggests the abrupt change as we cross the boundary because the map does not show total values and average values, high variation within an area. That's what I was saying earlier about Gipton and Hare Hills. It suggests that they're all uniformly unemployed, whereas there might be different levels of employment and unemployment within that region. So now we're on the more sophisticated command terms. This one is compare. In a compare question, you need to look at the similarities and differences, and you need to join ideas together. So you need to think of a specific element related to the question, and you need to see how it affects both sides of an argument and show if there's similarity or contrast there. For an example, we can look at this question from the textbook, compare the impact of droughts in the developing and the developed country that you've studied. Now, note here, just to understand the question as it's asked, we're underlining the command term there, impacts, so I need to talk about more than one of them, and it's asked me for developed countries that you have studied. So I'm going to have to quote data in the response to this. So, my first statement, I'm going to look at agriculture. I want to make the point that agriculture will go into decline in both countries due to drought. Drought means there's not enough water available for the plants, so plants in both countries will end up with less water, they will grow less well, the farmer will have a smaller yield, the farmer will produce less food. So that's a similarity I'm pointing out. I can then go on to point out a contrast. If a farmer in a high-income country, for instance, we studied California in the US, if a farmer in California has less water, well, that caused them to lay off farm workers. So some farm workers became unemployed. Some of the farmers may have become bankrupt, maybe needed to take out loans. Whereas in a developing country, we studied Ethiopia in 1984, we can talk about the famine that was generated there because many farmers were subsistence farmers. So all of their income came from their own farm. All of their food came from their own farm. So if their food supply disappeared, if their yield went down, that was actually their food supply disappearing, unlike the American farmers who buy most of their food at the supermarket, just as you or I do. In order to get all marks, of course, I now need to repeat that point. I need to find another topic to discuss, for instance, provision of water for drinking or for washing, and I need to extend that point. Here we have an explain question. In this, you're trying to show the reason for something, looking for cause and effect relationships. Your answer to an explain question is likely to be of the form, this is A has happened, so this will lead to B, which means C will happen. Or A has happened because of B, and this will lead to C. Yeah, we're looking at cause-effect relationships. So, explain one characteristic of counter-urbanization shown in Figure C. Well, here we have the population of this country village, which is over 1,000 on evening and weekends, but no one's lived there during the day. It's obviously become a dormitory village, dormitory settlement, so it's just where people who work in the town go to sleep, go to live on the weekends, but they all work, they shop in town. Now, how do we express that idea? Well, a couple of suggestions here. Many people who move from towns and cities still work in the urban area, which means that the population of the village is very low during the week, which could lead to the loss of shops, local services, etc. Or the village can become a ghost town because the residents work in the larger urban area, which leads to loss of local tradition. So you're looking at a cause and effect relationship. This has happened, therefore that happens, therefore that happens. You're looking to chain together events or causes and effects. Before we go into the more complicated command terms, we're going to just have a look at the assessment objectives. AO1 is mainly about recall. So that's examined in the shorter questions at the beginning. AO2 is about your understanding of concepts and interrelationships. Did you understand the theories you talked about in class? Can you discuss them? Can you explain what they mean? AO3 is to do with applying these concepts in a somewhat new circumstance with new information maybe. So you're looking at a graph, you're looking at an image, you can remember what you learned in class, and you can apply the lessons you learned about Dawlish Warren to this new area of coastline that you have not seen before. It's just appeared in the exam paper. AO4 is about skills and your ability to use techniques to investigate maybe a resource or to say how you would carry out some kind of investigation. So this command term is suggest. When given a suggest question, you need to make a point, you need to justify that point, you need to kind of back yourself up, say why your point is correct. So suggest one reason for the differences in the number of deaths shown in figure 7. Here, figure 7, there are different numbers of deaths in different years with different numbers of hurricanes. When you look at it, you think, the immediate thought is, well, there's 8 hurricanes in 2012 and there were more deaths, far more deaths in 2012. Maybe it's the high numbers, but you look further down and actually the second highest number of deaths occur with just 4 hurricanes, and the smallest number of deaths occur with 6 hurricanes. So that simple relationship isn't there. I need to suggest something else. I could suggest that maybe years when more hurricanes make landfall, that will lead to more deaths. Okay, so that's my suggestion, but I now have to back that up, don't I? I now have to justify that. So if more hurricanes make landfall, that will mean there will be flooding on the land that could drown people. There we go. I've made a point and I've justified my point. Maybe it could be that some years the storms are stronger than others, so it's not really the number of hurricanes that matters, their category. So maybe in 2012 there were more high category, i.e. Cat 5 hurricanes on the Saffir-Simpson scale. This would lead to more deaths because, and then I could justify that by talking about a greater amount of flooding, higher winds causing more danger, etc. Let's have a little look at the mark scheme there. Have a look down. In some cases, people cut down trees, that leads to deforestation, which reduces the amount of rainwater that's intercepted. Or burning of fossil fuels, so you can talk about the greenhouse effect, leading to higher sea levels, and so people are more vulnerable in the first place. All of these suggestions in the mark scheme, and note it says accept any other appropriate responses. So what you really need is a reasonable argument that is a coupled statement. This is why it might be the case, and I will justify it, I'll back it up with argument. Now we're into examine, which is one of the command terms you'll expect on the longer answer questions, the 8 markers at the end of a unit. In an examine question, you need to break down the complex idea into a number of smaller parts. You need to explain how each small part works, or a number of the smaller parts work. You then need to bring them back together to synthesize the ideas and show how they interrelate, how they work together. Let's look at an example. Examine how the physical factors and human activities affect the risk of flooding in this landscape. Here we have a picture of York. If we have a quick look around it, we can see where the flooding is most likely along the river there. 3 large rivers join together, join the River Ouse just before it reaches York there. So we have confluences. That's a natural factor, delivering more water into the River Ouse, increasing the likelihood of flooding. If we look to the west of the map, we can see Marston Moor has been deforested for farming. Well, that's a human activity. And I look at that and I think, well, I remember in class studying the impact of trees on flooding, that trees will encourage infiltration, trees will soak up water, they will increase transpiration rates, and because they increase evapotranspiration, they decrease flooding. Well, if you remove the trees, the opposite happens. There's less infiltration, there's more runoff, there's more soil erosion. And so I'm trying to link the ideas that I learned in class, I link the concepts I learned in class to the evidence that's here, because that's going to allow me to link my AO3 skills, these are the concepts that I'm trying to apply, and my ability to take information off this GIS, off this Geographical Information System, off this layered map. Right, looking at the AO3 marks that are available, don't forget AO3, this is understand, analyse, evaluate. Flooding occurs when discharge of the river increases beyond the point of capacity. There, I'm just showing my overall understanding. What is flooding about? I can now talk about what human activities maybe could lead to it, because the question tells me to talk about physical processes and human activities. So I can talk about human activity, I can talk about deforestation, as I mentioned earlier on Marston Moor. I'm going to make a PEE statement. So deforestation reduces infiltration rates. It increases overland flow or runoff, leading to a higher peak, a shorter lag time, and more likelihood of flooding. There's my point, and I've explained my point. It gets the water to the river more quickly, which makes the river more likely to flood. But now I need to evidence that, because I need to show those AO4 skills of extracting data off the map I was looking at earlier. Well, I can then talk about Marston Moor, which has been deforested for farming, and I can explain why that will have led to flooding specifically in York. And I'm going to use terms like Marston Moor, and talk about York, and talk about the River Ouse, to make sure that the examiner knows I'm looking at this map. I'm not talking generically about floods. I'm then going to write another statement. I've just talked about a human activity, and so now I'm going to look at a physical process. I'm going to talk about the fact that it's rained an awful lot, as it told us in the map. Well, that fact it rained an awful lot, that would lead to soil becoming saturated, a lack of pore space, therefore no more infiltration takes place, therefore we get more runoff. Now I need to evidence that, because for my AO4 marks, I need to be able to prove my argument with reference to the example I've been given. And in here it tells us sustained rainfall during December 2015 meant that the soil was already saturated. And so I'll use that as the evidence, the final E in my PE statement. I then need to tie these together and show that it's not simply deforestation that's led to this flooding. Deforestation has led to this flooding. It's been a contributing factor, but also the fact that the land was urbanized, and in my case, because I've used deforestation and rainfall as the main factors, deforestation and very heavy rainfall have both contributed to this flood. I show how they work together to produce the flood. And that means that we've got reduced infiltration rates due to the lack of trees, the pore space fills up quickly due to the very heavy rain, and therefore we get more runoff for both of these reasons, and that's why York ends up with floods. That's synthesizing the points at the end. So here we have assess. Similar to evaluate in some ways, in that we need to break an idea down and talk about component parts. However, in assessment, we're looking to rank those component parts. Which one is the most important, which one controls, or which one has the greatest influence upon the result. Assess the factors that have influenced growth of core and peripheral areas within either a developing or emerging country. Now, we're going to talk about India because that's the one we studied, but clearly you could talk about whichever one you wanted. The examiner doesn't get to choose. First of all, we have AO2 marks here for demonstrating understanding. I'll start off with an opening statement that's going to say what core periphery is and why it might develop, the characteristics of a core area with its higher employment, better wages, better education, and peripheral areas will tend to lack investment, have poor services, poor quality of life. Now, why do these differences occur? Well, there are a number of different things. We could talk about natural factors. For instance, we could talk about some areas being particularly mountainous with poor communication. That's the case for Uttar Pradesh, and so we could say that is a reason that drives Uttar Pradesh toward being a peripheral region, because its mountainous nature makes communications difficult. It's hard to set up, for example, manufacturing. It's got steep slopes, so farming is less likely to be productive. I'll then need to look at the opposite of that, so a place that has some kind of geographical natural advantage. Well, we looked at some areas that are along the coast, and so they're much better for, say, manufacturing, trading. Shipbuilding, for instance, is a big industry in Tamil Nadu, and because they're on the coast, they can also manufacture and sell things overseas, and so that helps Tamil Nadu to grow. We could talk about human factors as well, so we can talk about ideas of FDI. Are foreign companies investing in different regions, and why does that happen? How does that change the type of development? AO3, now I'm looking at my ability to interpret and analyse information. Over time, the unevenness of development may change within a country. Now, can I explain why that might happen? Is that because of a change in the importance of certain factors about the resources available in different areas? Maybe this could be due to a political shift. Once I've come up with some of these statements, so I've talked about the importance of physical factors, I've talked about the ideas of governance or FDI, where the government is or where the government's focusing on development, I now need to come to bring all this together. I need to synthesize this information, and I need to try and bring myself to a reasoned conclusion where I decide which factors are maybe the most important. So if we look down at the bottom, level 3, the point on AO3 here, I've come to a balanced, well-developed argument. It's synthesized some relevant understanding and coherently leads to judgments, and those judgments have to be supported by evidence. So that's where I've done my reading. I've made sure I understood my case study of India, and I could talk about the different industries that take place in the different core peripheral regions and the reasons for their growth, discussing FDI, discussing natural factors, discussing governance. And so I can say, I think the main influence is, and come to a conclusion on that and back that conclusion up with both argument and evidence. So this command term is discuss. Here we're looking to take apart a whole argument and talk about its strengths and weaknesses. The question here is discuss the view that development within UK national parks creates pressures on both the local environment and people. Now, there's a clear temptation when you read, when you know you're looking at this kind of question, to see weaknesses and strengths, so you write a paragraph on strengths, a paragraph on weaknesses, and come to a conclusion. I would advise against that. I think if you do that, you miss out on a lot of opportunities for discussion and argument. I'd rather structure it by saying, what are the impacts? What are the pressures on the local environment? What are the pressures on the local people? So there I've got two different titles for paragraphs. I've got one all about the pressures caused by the pressure of development on the environment, another about the pressure of development on people. And inside each of those paragraphs, I can talk about the strengths and the weaknesses, the positives and negatives. Yeah, is it causing pressure? Is the development helping the local environment? And do the same for the local people, and then come to a conclusion at the end. In this question, you can see it's worth 12. It's worth 12 because 4 of those marks come from spelling, punctuation, grammar, and use of technical terminology. This is very important. Obviously a large weight of marks here on the most heavily marked question in the paper. And so you need to make sure you pick all of those up. Of particular note is this point. You need to ensure that you use a wide range of specialist terms. So you need a number of specialist terms. You need to set up paragraphs in a way that encourages you, forces you to use the technical terminology. Don't avoid it. Look for opportunities to use it. And this is what the level 3, the best response, has here. We've picked up some marks from AO2 because you demonstrated that you understand the concepts. We've now applied this understanding in AO3. You've produced a balanced and well-developed argument. Important here is your ability to synthesize relevant understanding. So you're bringing together different strands of the argument to produce a whole. That's very important in a discussion, that you can talk about different impacts on the environment and people, but when you come to the conclusion, you can bring it all together to come up with a complete answer to the question. A complete answer in this case to the idea that development within UK national parks will create pressure on both local environment and people. You need to say if this is true. Is it always true? Does it need to be? What can be done to prevent that from happening? And finally, to get all the marks for AO4 here, we need to have used geographical skills to obtain accurate information. At the top it says, I need to have extracted information from these 4 resources, and AO4 is a measurement of my ability to have done that. So where it says I'm picking these marks up, these marks come from my ability to use the resource booklet and demonstrate that I've used it. So I'm going to quote terms from the resource booklet and they use data that was in the resource booklet. And that really proves that I've used it and demonstrates that I should get the mark. Finally, we're on to evaluate, which is our last command term. Important to differentiate this kind of answer from the answer you give to an assess question. In an assess question, we're looking at a whole idea breaking it down into component parts and measuring them, ranking them, saying which one is most or least important. In the evaluate question, we're often looking at solutions to a problem. And in evaluate, we're saying which solution is the best, which one is the most effective, which one will happen the quickest, last for the longest, which one can be applied in more circumstances. We're saying which solution is better than the other solutions. In this case, we're looking at how we solve the problem of threats to deciduous woodlands in a named region. You would name the New Forest, because that's the one we did. We start off, we need to pick up our AO2 marks here, and our AO2 marks come initially from our ability to discuss the problems that do threaten deciduous woodlands, such as the expansion of urban areas. You can then look at some solutions to these problems. Sustainable activities such as pollarding, it suggests here, monitoring techniques at the bottom. We need to evaluate our solutions. Now, the solutions you're likely to come up with are those specific to the New Forest. For instance, there were the 5 Ways to Love the Forest leaflet that's handed out to people, the Green Leaf Business scheme, and the voluntary sustainable transport scheme. We could line those 3 up, explain how they work, and then we need to assess them. Well, for that you're going to need assessment criteria, and we can assess them as to how sustainable they are. Do they allow local people? Do they allow the park to develop and function now? Will they allow that function to continue in the future? That's a sustainable solution. And once you've set up your criteria that you're looking to produce a sustainable solution, or you're looking to find sustainable solutions, you can then measure these different ideas against that sustainability criteria. And so in general, you look to set up an assessment or an evaluation criteria, and then you look at each of the different ways of solving your problem, and you'll measure each of them against that evaluation criteria. And here's what the ideal answer will look like. So you've demonstrated some understanding of the concepts and the interrelationships in the place, and then you've been able to synthesize ideas, make judgments, and decide which of these solutions to the problem is likely to be the most effective.